Hi everyone, number one Marmaduke fan here with a brand new mic. I'm trying out new professional settings. It's supposed to improve the sound quality. Is this the end of an era? No more iPhone, no more and the sound jumping all over the place and the cat meowing in the background. So apparently the way this is supposed to work is if the cat comes and meows, I'll be able to hear the cat, but you won't. No more Luna guest star appearances. It's amazing. So, hat tip to Bacon Bravo, by the way, for this suggestion. Thank you very much. So, today I want to take a look at the very first version of Dungeons and Dragons. This is, I guess, what would be called Edition 0 because it's even before the first edition came out. It's full of typos and goofy little illustrations. So the reason I wanted to check this out was I did a Dungeons and Dragons campaign. I'm still working on some videos for that for my campaign in the background. But I wanted to go back, return to tradition, see how it was back in the old days. This is not going to be a thorough review of the game. I'm not really interested in trying to play 1970s style Dungeons and Dragons games. This is also not going to be a thorough history of how it works. I have a recommendation for that. If you want the thorough documentary style history video, the YouTube channel DM It All has a great, history channel style video where it talks about the people who came together and how they made this game and how the game evolved and changed. So I would recommend that if you want sort of a general overview. This is going to be essentially me telling you what I thought was cool out of the book. Okay, I hear Luna. Do you guys hear Luna? Let me know in the comments if you hear Luna, because that means the mic is working. All right, so basically, I'm just going to spurg about all the cool things I found while reading the book. One of the things that surprised me is I was expecting it to be kind of goofy and unprofessional and very very indie, and it was all those things almost charmingly. So, and it was also very bare bones. You're not going to get tons of lore out of it. But having read it, I actually would recommend you go back and read the Whitebox PDF of Dungeons and Dragons, because it actually does have some really interesting ideas. It sounds like a completely different game than 5th edition, but it actually does sound like a fun game. And people call this Gygaxian prose. So it's written by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson. So Gygaxian prose is Gygax has this very distinct writing style. I would describe Gygax as being your nerdy uncle who's such a geek and he's so enthusiastic about these things that he makes you enthusiastic by proxy. So it was actually an enjoyable little thing to read because of all of the interesting incidental little comments and such. So right off with the introduction, you get the basic story of how they came together and were wargaming. So one of the important things about this, by the way, is it was originally meant as a supplement for a pre-existing game called Chainmail. And in Chainmail, you would have knights running around and battling on the field. And so TSR wanted to put out booklets so that you could play fantasy magic and sword and sorcery in the chainmail system. So one of the interesting things about Dungeons and Dragons is it originally wasn't a entirely concrete individual system. It was an add-on to something else. I'm not going to get into chainmail because you can get those booklets. That's basically its own whole system. It's a little difficult because sometimes they'll just reference the chainmail rules and tell you to go play that. But I'm not going to. That's a little too detailed for my interest. So in the introduction, there was this really juicy quote where they talk about some of the fantasy inspirations of Dungeons and Dragons. Quote: "These rules are strictly fantasy. Those wargamers who lack imagination, those who don't care for Burroughs' Martian adventures where John Carter is groping through black pits, who feel no thrill upon reading Howard's Conan saga, who do not enjoy the De Camp and Pratt fantasies, or Fritz Lieber's Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser pitting their swords against evil sorcerers, will not be likely to find Dungeons and Dragons to their taste. But those whose imaginations know no bounds will find that these rules are the answer to their prayers. With this last bit of advice, we invite you to read on and enjoy a world where the fantastic is fact and magic really works." Signed, Gary Gygax, Tactical Studies Rules Editor. So what's cool about that is I've read Edgar Rice Burroughs' John Carter of Mars books. I still haven't picked up Howard's Conan the Barbarian, but I've read some of the comics based on Conan the Barbarian, but I've never heard of these other guys, right? So, okay, De Camp and Pratt fantasies and Fritz Lieber's Fafnir and the Gray Mouse, right? So I'm not even through the introduction, and I've already got like a list of cool fantasy authors to go check out. As they go on to kind of give you an overview of the game, one interesting thing is we get the idea of rules as guidelines right off the bat, even in kind of like pre first edition. And it's interesting that the writers also they give you things like tables and such to run the old version of the game, which you're probably not going to run unless you're like a real hard school old school type. But Gygax also gives you general advice on how to run a game that feels like it'd just be generally applicable. So, for example, he says, "We advise, however, that a campaign be begun slowly, following the steps outlined herein, so as to avoid becoming too bogged down with unfamiliar details at first. That way, your campaign will build naturally at the pace best suited to the referee and players." And it, incidentally, originally the term for DM, there was no DM, there was the referee. I'll talk more about that later. Close parentheses. Quote, "Soothing the way for all concerned. New details can be added and old laws altered so as to provide continually new and different situations." And he even mentions you might want to write your rule changes in pencil in case you want to change them later. So basically, the entire game is completely different from what I played in 5th edition and the kind of the style of game that I presented in my first game. So one of the obvious changes is you are most definitely going to die in a old school Dungeons and Dragons game. It's common, it's expected, it adds to the thrill. So it's less about you playing a character in a story who's going on an arc and your death ought to be satisfying, and more run and gun, let's get through this dungeon. Of course you're going to die. It's almost more like a video game. You die over and over again trying to beat the level, trying to beat the dungeon. And some of this, I think, is a holdover from Chainmail. In Chainmail, it's not about you playing Sir Lancelot or whatever. It's about you commanding a field of troops. One of the other big changes is size of groups. At one point, they mentioned that one referee should maybe referee about 20 people, maybe up to 50 people. Whereas, of course, in modern games, it's about 4 or 5 people at a table. So this is so you kind of have to like delete what you know about 5th edition from your mind to get what the heck is going on throughout this book. This is more large groups of people moving through the dungeons competitively at high speed. And there's some really interesting sections later where they describe the flow of how a game plays out. TSR recommended you not to expand the scope of a campaign beyond a medieval setting. For example, don't introduce time travel right off the bat until your players have had the chance to explore the medieval aspect thoroughly. So what I like about this is generally applicable. Start slow, don't throw the time travel space robots off them right off the bat. Build up to the time travel robots. He has this very charming quote about figurines. So figurines were not required, but these guys clearly loved playing with the figurines. Quote, "Miniature figures can be added if the players have them available and so desire, but miniatures are not required, only aesthetically pleasing. Similarly, unit counters can be employed, with or without figures, although by themselves the bits of cardboard lack the eye appeal of the varied and brightly painted miniature figures." Nerd! What a nerd. I love this guy. Moving on to my next note. Okay, the classes were completely different. So back in the day, the only 3 classes were fighting men, magic users, and clerics. Halflings and dwarves could only play as fighting men, and they had level caps, limiting how high they could progress. Elves could play as a fighting man or as a magic user, and they could switch in between adventures. They couldn't do it off the drop of the hat. It had to be at a specific point. So it wasn't multi-classing, it was dual classing, but elves also had a upper limit on how high they could progress as a magic user or a fighting man. Only humans could be clerics. What's kind of interesting about this is it puts more emphasis on the humans. Humans have the most potential, essentially, and it's sort of assumed that the fantasy races are functionally different than the common classes of humans, right? It puts a bit more distance between human races and fantasy races. There's also a lot of talk about how the races and the classes are different and how they balance. I won't get into all that, but it's fewer classes, and they're less. It's less about trying to make all the classes balanced with one another, and more having each class have a really strong element and weak element. So, for example, magic users on purpose were the strongest fighters late game, but they're very weak early game. So you need fighters and clerics basically to guard the magic users. There's a lot of emphasis and talk about building fortresses, which again, you can sort of see the connection between the medieval style war games, right? Eventually, players are going to want to amass enough resources where they buy a castle and they become the baron of a castle. And so fighting men and noticeably clerics have advantages on building fortresses. So you might not be the strongest in a fight, but you might have, and you provide an advantage to the team outside of combat by creating a base of operations. Another incidental comment, I learned what a Turkopole was by reading this. So they recommend that you use what's called a Turkopole troop from Chainmail. I thought, what the heck is that? So it was basically a specific type of medieval soldier. There's a Wikipedia article about that. Man, I'm learning so much by reading about D&D. I'm finding out about things I didn't know about. Okay, and then the next funny thing is halflings. By the way, they call them halflings in this book, which means the book I have, it must have been produced after they got the cease and desist from the Tolkien estate for using the word hobbit. So halflings are, by design, the weakest race. They are mathematically weaker than anybody else. And Gygax has this great side comment where he says, should any player wish to play as one, they can choose to play as a halfling. So allegedly, Gygax was not a big fan of Lord of the Rings and hobbits. So I totally buy that his way of dunking on them was to make them weak in the early game. However, I noticed that it mentions halflings are good at throwing things and throwing rocks. So the lore of halflings being excellent rock throwers is apparently canon. It goes all the way back to the oldest edition. It's also kind of fun when they present a example of something. So their example of a character is named Xylarthen, and he's a magic user, and it gives you all his stats. So is this the first D&D character ever created? Who knows? But we'll talk about more stuff like that. Okay, illustrations. Let's talk a little bit about this illustration. So this is an elf, right? Now, this elf has like a full beard, like a dwarf. It has a helmet, but apparently it also has like a pointy Keebler elf hat like Link would wear. Wow. I don't know about you. I never would have imagined an elf in my head if someone told me think of an elf. This is completely different than what I ever thought an elf might be. So the first booklet about men and magic, it was basically telling you what kind of characters the players could play. Monsters and treasure is, wouldn't you know it, it's about monsters and treasure. So a long list of monsters and how much gold they might have, tables to figure all that stuff out, and magic items people can use. So just like how the game assumes larger groups of people, it also assumes larger groups of monsters. And this was kind of maybe like the most disappointing section. I was hoping to get like lots of lore about the monsters, but so I didn't get tons of lore, but I did find some interesting things. So one of the ways they simplified it is a lot of monsters are similar to one another. So buccaneers are basically similar to pirates, but they'll have maybe one will get a little bonus to their morale stat, or one will get a little bit more treasure. So they're using similar templates for enemies you fight, and then just adjusting the numbers up and down slightly to have one be a stronger version of the other. So when I was reading about gnolls look completely different in 0 edition than you're used to. So the 5th edition gnolls are basically like hyena dudes. Gnolls, originally they described them as a cross between gnomes and trolls. And then they have a parenthetical comment. Perhaps Lord Sunsine did not really make it all that clear. And this is a typo. They meant to say, I'm sure they meant to say Lord Dunsany. So what's interesting about that is we're getting another clue about the inspiration for these games. I've never heard of this guy, but Lord Dunsany, the Baron of Dunsany, he was a fantasy writer, and he wrote about elves and such. So apparently the original D&D version of gnolls were inspired by this writer. I gotta check him out, right? So something of interesting to me, by the way, about vampires is they specifically mention that vampires are not lycanthropes. They're not werewolves. They're an undead creature. What I'm assuming is going on there is in a lot of classical vampire stories, vampires are related to werewolves. A werewolf dies and it becomes a vampire. So it's interesting to me that they specify that vampires are not werewolves in Dungeons and Dragons. Our vampires are different, but vampires are afraid of the cross. All the normal things like garlic, and they don't show up in mirrors, but vampires are scared of Christianity in Dungeons and Dragons, which implies Christianity exists in old school Dungeons and Dragons, right? So this is before all of the Forgotten Worlds lore, where it became more polytheistic. Another thing to note about the monster list is it's not alphabetical. It's very kind of haphazard. So one of the points where I kind of noticed this is they have Medusae, and then immediately after Medusae, they have Gorgons. Well, that's not alphabetical. Why do they have it that way? Because Medusa in Greek myth was a Gorgon. So they're listing these monsters not in an alphabetical order, but kind of in like the stream of consciousness order, where, oh yeah, Medusa, they have something to do with Gorgons, so let's just put them in that order, right? It's very the presentation style is just very like, yeah, just put it out there. It's not very clean. Typos everywhere. Here's my favorite thing. This made the entire thing worth it. Was this illustration? This is an official Dungeons and Dragons illustration, and I love it. Let's look at this and just see what we can find. So first off, all four guys have just these big cartoon noses and goofy smiles. At the lead, we've got our knight or our paladin, and he's armed with a sword that has a face and cartoon sweat beads. So he has a living sword that's nervous about their situation. The magic user has a goofy cartoon hat right straight out of The Magician's Apprentice. The rogue is picking the magician's pocket, and a priest, a cleric who is literally supposed to be a Christian Friar Tuck type with cross and everything. He's clearly observing the rogue stealing from another player, and he's just pleased with this. Like, oh yes, my child, I already forgive your sins for stealing from your compatriot without even you having to confess. I love it. I want this on a t-shirt. This is amazing. So that was my highlight. Another thing to note is they frequently have almost cute asides. So when they describe minotaurs, the minotaur is classically a bull-headed man, and all of us who have debated rules are well acquainted with such. Gnomes originally had beards. Let me read this. Slightly smaller than dwarves and with longer beards, these creatures usually inhabit the hills and lowland burrows as opposed to the mountainous homes which dwarves choose. So the first thing when I heard about gnomes in D&D is my thought jumped straight to garden gnomes. Well, apparently the bearded garden gnomes are canon too to Edition 0. So here's a chart that kind of cracked me up. It's discussing how to use cursed scrolls. And makes the point that if you want them to use the cursed scroll, you might want to have non-cursed scrolls disappear on occasion. And the worst role for a cursed scroll is it just transportation to another planet. So just boom, you're on another planet now. You're on Mars. I get. What did they do to piss off Gygax this bad, I wonder? So after the monster section, the next section is explanation of magic items. And most interesting lore thing to me about swords is it mentions that swords, uniquely among magic items, possess certain human and superhuman attributes. So for example, swords have an alignment, lawful, neutral, or chaotic. And by the way, back then there wasn't good and evil. There was only lawful and chaotic. Lawful roughly equated to good. Chaotic roughly equates to evil. I've got a whole video I'm planning about that where I want to talk about Powell Anderson books, and I have a theory that they basically just cribbed this idea from Powell Anderson's 3 Hearts and 3 Lions. But for now, all you need to know is that there's lawful, there's neutral, and there's chaotic. So swords can have this alignment, swords can have intelligence, and swords could have what was called an egoism score. So it's like if you have an intelligent sword that believes it's a powerful, good sword, or it's a wicked sword that wants to serve a wicked master, you might have to roll to determine if you can control the sword, or it might fail you on purpose. It might betray you and want to go to another master, things like that. So one of the reasons why I think we had that cartoony sword with the cartoon sweat beads is living good and evil swords were apparently a big deal in Edition Zero. There was a potion called Potion of Dragon Control that would allow you to mind control 1 to 3 dragons. Oh, I'm sure you could give that to your players in D&D 5th edition, no problem. That's not unbalanced at all. There was something called a Helm of Chaos or a Helm of Law. And if the player put it on, they immediately switch to either being lawful or chaotic, which at this point basically determines whether you're good and evil. So you could be like going through a dungeon, la-di-da-di-da, oh look, here's a helmet, put it on, boom, you're evil. And then the rule specifies that the person affected by this helmet will resist any attempt to have it pried off by force. So if you put on an evil chaos helmet, congratulations, you are evil now, and you will fight to the death to prevent them from taking the Helm of Chaos from you. That seems like a great troll item. This has got to be the coolest and dumbest named item I've ever seen. It's called an Amulet versus Crystal Balls and ESP. And there's another one they called Mind Control ESP back then. That takes me right out of it. Well, I guess that's the thing, is it's fantasy, but they don't mind including sci-fi elements like travel to alien worlds, travel to Mars and such. It's a lot more loosey-goosey on the distinction between fantasy than sci-fi than we are now, I think. Maybe we're too strict about putting sci-fi and fantasy into separate boxes. Okay, so an amulet versus crystal balls was basically an amulet you could wear. I'll read it because it's a little awkwardly worded. This device presents the location, site, or thought waves pickup by crystal ball or ESP. It is always effective. So what's cool about this is the way I read this is you put on the amulet and it lets you see someone who is using a crystal ball or see someone who is using an ESP on you. It doesn't say it protects you from having crystal balls and ESP used on you. You just know right where they are. Oh, you're reading my mind? Well, I'm reading your GAPS location data. Here I come. Here I come, dude, right? Get out of my brain. That seems like really cool. So it's a dumb name, but that actually sounds like a really useful item, right? To counteract people who are using scrying or using divination magic. The third booklet, The Underworld and Wilderness Adventures. This probably has the most stuff that's relevant to dungeon design and traps. So back then, the Underdark, what is called the Underdark now, was called the Underworld. And Gygax presents these really simplistic, really hard to read maps, and then he provides commentary on them to describe his design process. So a sample cross-section of levels shows you how you could have levels branching, so it's not just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in a straight line, but you could actually go to this place and then wrap around and go in this direction. A quote, "In beginning a dungeon, it is advisable to construct at least 3 levels at once, noting where stairs, trapdoors, and chimneys and slanting passages come out on lower levels, as well as the mouths of chutes and teleportation terminals. In doing the lowest levels of such a set, it is also necessary to leave space for the various methods of egress to still lower levels. A good dungeon will have no less than a dozen levels down, with offshoot levels in addition, and new levels under construction, so that players will never grow tired of it. There is no real limit to the number of levels, nor is there any restriction on their size, other than the size of graph paper available. Greyhawk Castle, for example, has over a dozen levels in succession downwards, more than that number branching from these, and not less than 2 new levels under construction at any given time. These levels contain such things as a new museum from another age, an underground lake, a series of caverns filled with giant fungi, a bowling alley for 20-foot-high giants, an arena of evil crypts, and so on." So one interesting thing about this is giving us some lore about Gary Gygax's own campaign, the Greyhawk campaign. So I guess this is, if you're a D&D history nerd, this is really relevant. So wait a minute, does this confirm? Did Gary Gygax really have a bowling alley for 20-foot-high giants? Well, maybe not. Maybe that's just him being Gygax and joking around. But it's at least possible that Gary Gygax had a bowling alley for 20-foot-high giants in the Greyhawk campaign. The other interesting thing is kind of the assumption that a dungeon is a place where players might be coming back again and again, so he's building and adding to it to make it interesting and fresh for returning players. So there's definitely this emphasis on a big, giant dungeon that you tackle over and over again trying to get through. A sample level is shown below in order to aid the prospective referee in designing his own game. So Gygax's sample level, I think there have been other YouTubers who have dug into this, so I'm not going to dive through all of it. So it's really badly drawn map. Some of the things on the map itself do not line up at all with what's on the keys. So there were times where I have to admit I was looking at this and looking at his description, and I just couldn't find what the heck he was talking about. Right? Like, so Gygax learn how to write with proper handwriting. So anyway, however, the commentary is really worth reading because he gives you a lot of ideas of devious traps and things you can use generally in any dungeon. So one important thing about this level is this is not supposed to be a level you actually use. This is supposed to be a combination of different elements you could use in a given dungeon design. And there are even points where he says, you probably shouldn't use this unless you're really ticked at your players and want to punish them. I would just recommend going ahead and just reading this section for yourself if you want to DM rather than hear me try to summarize it for you. You're going to have to look at it carefully and look back and forth at the map and Gygax's commentary to get what the heck is going on. I will comment on one part of it that I thought was really intelligent. So number 3 on this map is showing diagonal passages. And Gygax's point with including diagonal passages is diagonal passages make it harder for a player to map the dungeon. So he's assuming that somebody's there with graph paper trying to make a map of the dungeon as they work through the dungeon. And he shows you that if you use these diagonal turns, you can mix them up really easy. So if you imagine, you're sitting there with your graph paper and the DM says, turn left. You think, okay, we're going east. We're going to turn left and go north. And the DM says, now you turn right and go down a corridor. And you think, okay, we're going to turn right. So that means we must be going east again, right? And then you come to the end of the corridor and the DM says, okay, you turn right. And you think, okay, well, if we're turning right, that must mean we're going south. But no, that's not what happened at all. Now, you're not going south, you're going west because the diagonals messed you up. That's so devious. Now, what's cool about that is it's a great trick, but it's simple. The other one is Gygax loved the idea of having a level, having a long hallway where you would slowly ascend at such a soft angle you wouldn't notice you were ascending. So what that would mean is you could come up a level higher or a level lower and then get mixed up about what level you were even on because you just went down one hallway. And lots of devious things like giant spiraling rooms with moving walls, rooms that'll teleport you onto the moon or into the center of the earth. So trust me, you just want to read this section. If you want to be a DM, just read this section and you'll get a lot of juicy ideas. Now, he even makes the point, don't throw this at all your players unless you want to really be mean to them. But if you want to be a little bit mean to them, this is a great checklist of things you can use. I did not understand. There's a lot of talk about converting inches to feet, which I assume this must be a reference to chainmail. So the basic idea is if you're in different settings, measurements seem to work differently. So he says that in the underworld, inches are converted to tens of feet, units of tens of feet or yards, right? It's yards in the overworld when you're in the wilderness. So what I assume that is that must be just a way of simplifying the system so you can use one system, but use it in more than one type of terrain. If you're a D&D nerd and you understand how that works, let me know in the comment section. But underworld, there's a lot of description of the underworld where it's a lot more devious. There's never a door with a handle in the underworld you always have to push through. If you fire off magic in the underworld, it could reverberate back on you. Basically, it sucks to be in the underworld. Probably one of the best sections in the whole booklet is the sample game. It's on page 12 to 14 of the last booklet, and it describes to you how a game might go, and it sounds completely different than any modern D&D game you've ever heard. So let me just give you some quick observations. It is very fast-paced. It's like boom, 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 boom. Not a lot of players stopping and discussing things. There's a player who takes on the role of the caller, and the caller is the one who speaks for the entire party. So he might confer with the party, but he's the one who describes what each person in his party does, right? So it gives one person this role of responsibility. You can kind of tell from the sample game that elves and dwarves radically impact their ability to navigate through the dungeon based on their racial characteristics and their ability to spot different things. And random encounters are really important in old D&D. So I've noticed a lot of modern DMs will say, I don't even see what the point is of using random encounters. So the point of using random encounters in old school D&D was to put a time pressure on it. You could poke around the room, but the longer you spend poking around the room, at any moment, monsters could come in and attack you. So random encounters are not slowing down combat. Random encounters are putting the pressure on you to move. Check out the room, get through the room, get to the next room, repeat the process. So it's less like it's less role play and more breakneck speed, bum rushing a dungeon is the impression I'm getting. There's a whole section on how players can build their own castles. Gygax shows you charts of different elements you can add to the castle and their costs, what it costs to hire the staff. So if you've got someone who is just into building a castle, I feel like you could use a lot of this. You could probably use all of these elements still. You'd have to update it to make it work in modern D&D, but it just seemed fun to me. Like, wow, I get to build a castle? That sounds awesome. This is my favorite thing probably in the whole book. It's called the Angry Villager rule. Anyone who has viewed a horror movie is aware of how dangerous angry villagers are. Whenever the referee finds that some player has committed an unforgivable outrage, this rule can be invoked to harass the offender in the line. Within the realm of angry villagers are thieves from the Thieves' Quarter, city watches and militia, etc. Also possible is the insertion of some character, like Conan, to bring matters into line. So if your players are being dicks, just throw Conan the Barbarian at them, and he'll teach them respect. I love it, man. Okay, on page 24, there's a nice little highlight where he talks about the other worlds rule. And what I love about this is basically saying you don't have to worry about how things work in the real world. You don't have to worry about real world astronomy. So he says you could have the stars be only a few hundred miles away from people. They could just be like little floating lights that we could theoretically run up and grab. Space could be full of breathable air. It might be possible to swim through space if you can just get up there. A big chunk of land might just be like a portal, like you walk through a foggy mist in a field and you end up on another planet, or you end up in dinosaur times. Later, I think when he's talking about naval combat, he mentions that if no monsters get the players while they're sailing their ships, they could just fall off the edge of the world. So if you want, the world could be flat. And I love that because it's just kind of like, if you don't realize you could do that, you might never think that. You might think, oh yeah, the planets are big rocks and they move around the sun. There's no reason why you couldn't use a weird medieval cosmology or a mythological cosmology. That might be fun in a fantasy game. They have a section of rules on aerial combat, which they nicknamed Battles in the Skies. And they say jokingly that they do this with no apologies to Mike Carr's aerial dogfight game, Fight in the Sky. So they basically ripped off another role-playing game that's about World War I dogfighting, and they pulled that into D&D to govern aerial combat and flight. They talk a bit about naval combat, and again, like, I'm not interested in like the nitty gritty of how to run this, but there is some interesting discussion of tactics like achieving ramming speed. Most medieval ships didn't have ramming capabilities, but they described how ramming could work. They described techniques like shearing oars, and how if you shear the oars, it'll probably kill half of the galley slaves rowing the ship if you shear the oars. And the only way for you to not shear your oars is to give the order to have the oars pulled aboard ship, right? So interesting little tactical things like that. And then they have a really charming afterword, kind of like to sum everything up. There are unquestionably areas which have been glossed over. While we deeply regret the necessity, space requires that we put in the essentials only, and the trimming will often have to be added by the referee and his players. We have attempted to finish an ample framework, and building should be both easy and fun. In this light, we urge you to refrain from writing for rule interpretations or the like, unless you are absolutely at a loss. for everything herein is fantastic, and the best way is to decide how you would like it to be, and then make it just that way. On the other hand, we are not loath to answer your questions, but why have us do any more of your imagining for you? Write to us and tell about your additions, ideas, and what have you. We could always do with a bit of improvement in our refereeing. Fight on with what is clearly some kind of Trace Jack Kirby illustration. So, an apology for everything being very brief and an encouragement to use your imagination and make your world the way you want it to be. And one charming exhortation as you go. And then they have like an advertisement for Dragon Magazine and encouragements for you to reach out. So very sweet, very charming. I would actually just like sit down and read this if you want to DM, because you're going to get a feel for Gygax's writing style and his sort of nerdy, imaginative approach to these things. Not a ton of lore, not like a ton of little details about, how do these monsters work and what powers do they have? But you can definitely get some cool little nuggets from it. So I had fun. The next on my reading list will be what is technically first edition, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons and Basic Dungeons and Dragons. I'll probably read Basic Dungeons and Dragons first because I still feel stupid and like this is a lot of new rules for me to absorb. So I'll start with Basic Dungeons and Dragons and move on to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, which is supposed to be Gygax's Galaxy Brain masterwork. So there you go. Have you played a Zero Edition D&D Whitebox style game? Are there any monsters or details from it that you would like to bring into a modern D&D game? Let me know in the comments and fight on. For example, what the heck is this? What?